Okay, great. So I have the wonderful task of standing between you and coffee. And clearly everybody is so tired that we've got about 20 extra minutes before the coffee, so now I have to extend a 20-minute presentation into 45 minutes and keep you awake before the coffee without you killing me. So we'll see how we go. First of all, thanks for the opportunity to be here. SSRN is, as some of you know, primarily open access repository that has a lot of relationships with publishers and others to share research as quickly and efficiently as possible, which generally means that not very many people really truly understand it. So I'll try to spend a few minutes giving you a better understanding of SSRN and really try to transition between, Orchid and Lori's talk about how that benefits and where that looks like in the future. Ellen's talk about researcher ID and the successes that TR's had, getting people to understand the value of an identifier, and hopefully lay the groundwork for you and to come in and really talk about some of the cool stuff that can actually happen once we get an understanding of who everybody is. So what I want to try to frame the conversation is that unique identifiers are needed to create unique influence. We don't know who somebody is. It's really, really hard to either give them any value or attribute anything to their reputation, or to actually, in this world of information overabundance, figure out how to order people in the rankings and all the other fun stuff that we do. Interestingly enough, I was in the airport and they always have the announcement when you never get to a gate, which unfortunately happens to me more than I'd care to admit. And they said, Atlanta passenger Greg Gordon, report immediately to gate 10. Atlanta passenger Greg Gordon, report immediately to gate 10. And I jumped up and I was looking for the waitress to pay my bill. And I'm not going to Atlanta. What the hell am I doing? And that's kind of just cute and funny, but that's the kind of stuff that we're talking about in a very real sense. My mother had this wonderful thought process that she wanted all of her children to have double initials. So I'm Greg Gordon. My brother is Jeff Gordon with a G. We have no English heritage whatsoever. And my sister, since she hated the name Gertrude, made up the name Gerette, G-E-R-E-T-T-E, which was no small source of ribbing from my brother and I to her. But besides that for a second, for her 30th birthday, her husband, actually a very nice guy, created the domain Gerette.com, and we all contributed pictures, and it was really kind of a wonderful thing. He made, this is about 10 years ago now, but made the website live, and within 2 weeks she had 6 emails from women around the world saying, "Oh my God, I thought I was the only Gerette in the world." SSRN's take on this is not about trying to have some sort of an altruistic bent or any mandates. What we really try to do is figure out what are the right incentives, what's the right environment for people to want to figure out who they are within our system. How can they create how can they organize their unique identifier so that they do have unique influence within the SSRN system? The key point here is that SSRN does not take a copyright from and within our world. The author is in control. If the author or a publisher puts up a paper, they're in control of the content. They can take it down, modify it, update it at any point in time. We try to think of ourselves as a level playing field so that everybody can play at the same time. And the earlier that we get in this flow of content, the master's level, the PhD candidate, the earlier we can, the easier this problem is to solve. If you were a publisher that had been around for hundreds of years and had never thought of trying to understand who each author was of the thousands or tens of thousands of papers that you had published, it's a different type of a problem. SSRN's only been around for about 20 years now, so it's been a little bit easier for us. But again, the focus has been on incentives. Now, we do have a lot of authors from a lot of different countries around the world. It's still predominantly US-based, but we're about to start a network with Bar-Ilan University for Hebrew. So that's going to create a whole nother set of problems because we have authors who are going to have both their name in Hebrew characters and their name in English characters, and we have to marry them together while still creating a unique identifier to allow them to be the same person for all of their English papers and the same person for all of their Hebrew papers. Now, I should probably have said earlier that we've been a strong supporter of ORCID since the beginning. I've been on the business working group since pretty much the beginning, and truly believe that ORCID is an important piece, and not because we think that there's some benefit of a central repository, but really there's a benefit of a central registry. There's a number of places around the world that already do very good jobs and will continue to do very good jobs in their disciplines. And on a very granular level, that's important. What makes sense to economists may not make sense to philosophers, certainly may not make sense to climatologists. So there's a different nuance at the more granular level, but a registry is what needed to try to pull it all together, so to speak, of bringing together these different systems to allow it all to work.
This is a world the U.S. is undersized, but we actually have a broad representation of authors from a number of different countries. So as I said a moment ago regarding the Hebrew problem, we've had to identify authors with multiple names. So within the SSRN system, you have your name, you have an alternative language name, and then you have a public display name. So just within little old SSRN, we actually have 3 names, possibly, for every single person. So if you think of some of the stuff that Lori talked about earlier, the complexity is much greater than just how many Smiths or Lees there are. When you start to go global, and that's one of the themes that we're here for, it becomes a much more complex problem. Now, SSRN gets a lot of content in. We're probably on a run rate of about 62,000 new submissions a year. In this particular slide, the blue dots are daily submissions and the red dots are revisions. So in the fall of 2007, we started to allow authors to revise their content. Again, SSRN has been primarily focused on earlier content, working paper, preprint, as many people like to refer to it as, gray literature. But this flow of information, these new revisions, allow people to kind of evolve the content over time. So again, another complexity is you start off with your maiden name, and then you have your married name, and then I think the phrase was, of course, you then have your maiden name again, or possibly a second married name. So the ability to kind of have this flow of names over time is another aspect that needs to be thought through in this problem. Now, as I said earlier, we get a lot of content in on a daily basis. We're running at 60-something thousand new submissions and over 30,000 revisions every year. So the content's continually evolving, and oftentimes the author name is one of the factors that changes. Now, when you get this much content, you kind of get some interesting things happen. And this is actually a new submission. It came in a few months ago. And this is one submission, and this is another submission. I can't make this stuff up. Within the SSRN world, you basically come into the submission system, you enter a bunch of metadata, and then all of the relational fields, author, affiliation, et cetera, are all linked. But you enter in a bunch of metadata. We give you a unique paper ID, and then you upload a PDF of the paper. Now, I will fully admit that I naively did not contemplate the potential problem of a camera phone picture being turned into a PDF being the actual submitted paper. But it has happened, and this particular author is adding several wrinkles to my world, but the one thing that I do appreciate the submission for is that I can, with complete sincerity, say that the SSRN library now includes everything, including the kitchen sink. But when we get time to break apart this in some citation tools that we talked about, I'm not exactly sure how that's going to, that we'll talk about in a few minutes, I'm not exactly sure how that works out. Within SSRN, we have about 180,000, almost 190,000 authors.
So when they come in, they generally come in as part of the submission process. Either you submit a paper, or your co-author submits a paper, or your school or organization submits a paper, and we bring it in. But every now and then we get a big bump. So back here in the late 90s, which was when the National Bureau of Economics research content came into the system, and then in the early 2000s was when the World Bank and IMF came in, and then when we brought in a large conference repository. Now when you think about that, that starts to add a whole nother level of complexity. I'm in the system as probably a name. I may be coming in from a publisher or a research organization or a former employer or a current employer with possibly another name, and then you need to try to marry those together. So that disambiguation is one of the complexities that I know Lori's wrestling with that is critical. Now, that's not a solvable today type of a problem, but as you start to think about some of the complexity and some of the reasons why you want to be doing this as early as possible, even if it is a bit painful, you want to be thinking about how you start to clean up the data today, which makes it much easier to do all the things tomorrow. So that when you start to become part of ORCID or you require ORCIDs, a lot of the other foundational work has already been accomplished. Now within SSRN, we count downloads, and last year we had a little over 9 million downloads. That's counted from an aggregate number of downloads of about 21.5 million. So between crawlers and search engines and amazingly authors who happen to have multiply clicked their own papers from their own university offices Monday through Friday, morning, noon, and night, we weed out all of those. But when you start to take downloads and then you add them into rankings, it becomes a very powerful incentive. If I'm showing up in a ranking as 3 different Greg Gordons, Greg with 1 G, Greg with 2 Gs, and Gregory with 1 G, which again I have my mother to thank. But if I show up at 3 different places, I now have an incentive to aggregate the Gregs together so that I get credit for all 3 of them. We also do that with papers. I want the paper to be attributed to me so I get credit for the downloads of that paper. So these are some of the incentives that we've been able to effectively crowdsource the cleanup and ongoing maintenance of the SSRN library by allowing authors a pretty strong reason to want to make sure that they're all the same, within the same, for the same person. Now, I've always loved this image and I've used it a lot, but what's kind of funny about it is that I used to talk about some of the reasons for the need for identifiers and metrics, as we'll talk about for a moment, is this information overabundance. Well, the information overabundance used to be this fire hose of information, right? And it used to be, we've all seen the slide. It's a fire hose and the spigot and the drip, and it's either intelligence or data or whatever you want to have coming out of the drop at the end of the spigot. And well, the reality is that we've exceeded the concept of a fire hose. And literally the amount of information that is coming out are absolute floodgates. So even within SSRN, the biggest complaint that we get is you're giving me too damn much research. So what I like to have people think about is how many of you read everything in your field? How many of you even know what everything in your field is anymore? I was working on a project with the Sloan Foundation on data sharing, and I had done a whole bunch of research and thought I had a good understanding of the foundations of what people had done and the incentives and the problems and all that kind of stuff. And then we went out and started to have some conversations. And one of the early conversations, I was in London meeting with some folks at JISC, and somebody in the room basically looked at, well, what did you think of our paper? And I said,
what paper? And he said, and this was about €120,000 project. He said, the project called To Share or Not to Share, Why Researchers Share Data. And it had completely gone under the radar for me. It had been put on the person's website and it had been published in a RIN publication in the UK, but it just never bubbled up to the surface for me. There was so much information out there. There was so much stuff going on. Because there wasn't an easy way to identify
who had written this paper in a system that allowed me to get to it in a streamlined fashion, it literally was unknown to me. Now, one of the things that I talk about is this growing abundance of scholarship, and the number of journals, scholarly journals, is doubling every 20 plus years. That's actually now a dated statistic. Raym Crow does a bunch of research for Spark and others, and he said that it's down to about 19 and a half years now. So the number of scholarly journals is doubling in every less than 2 decades. So it's important to be thinking about how, as publishers or users of publications, how do we start to get these identifiers in as quickly as possible so that we get better data going forward. Now, one of my favorite statistics is that 90% of all scientists that ever lived are alive today. So we've got a lot more people creating a lot more content for a lot more journals that used to be the simple, yes, this is the only thing I have to read. Now, one of the other things that SSRN is kind of helping to be a cause of is this access to earlier stage research. Again, it used to be an article that was published in a journal that was in your field that you had to read. And Larry Solom, a law blogger and scholar, legal scholar, wrote this paper called The 3 Papers of SSRN. What Larry wrote was that he now writes effectively 3 papers
For every paper that he writes. And the first one is this 8 to 10 page idea paper. I kind of stake my claim. I want to get it into, in this particular case, SSRN as early as possible. So people know that this is my area. So if somebody else is doing some research in there, maybe it's an opportunity to collaborate, or maybe I'm just kind of marking my territory to hopefully keep people away because I have this idea and I'm here first. The next one is the traditional draft, the working paper, maybe something you shared at a conference or a symposium where you actually solicited feedback from others to try to make the paper better. And then finally, obviously, is the published or final version or version of record. Now, arguably, in the SSRN world, I probably could extend that slide with a couple of more arrows because we have revisions coming on post-publication, quote unquote. And I'm sure many publishers have that too. So it's this evolving ideas. So we've gone from 1 to 3 or maybe 4 or maybe even 5 papers now that's kind of overwhelming the system. Now imagine that all 5 of those papers don't have an identifier that allow them to be linked together. Now the DOI can do that if each one has a DOI, but that still doesn't solve the author problem. Now, I wrote a little piece for Against the Grain, a library journal, about what we don't know, and it talks about article level metrics, and I'll briefly touch on that because somebody who's far smarter in this area than I am will be speaking after we all get a cup of coffee. But from an SSRN perspective, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, what we start to think about is downloads. Downloads kind of being, for us, a current measure of something of interest. Now, we certainly don't have any problem with citations, but citations, as we all know and love, take a little bit of time. We had a paper on privacy that came into the SSRN library a couple of years ago, Daniel Solop, and the paper had 22,000 downloads in the first 48 hours it was in our system. Now, I can't tell you whether it was a slow news day or not, but it happened to have gotten picked up by a number of blogs. It was over 2,000 blogs picked up this particular paper. It had to do with privacy on the internet and some other laws and things going on at that point in time. And then, of course, it just caught on fire. Well, certainly that's a measure of influence. It's something to be watching for, something that actually can help you figure out what you want to read. And that's primarily the way that we use metrics. Now, we didn't have a very good way. We looked at CiteSeers and a number of other tools to try to figure out how to glean citations. And because it's working papers, we couldn't exactly use some of the more established systems that were out there. So what we did was we created this system, and we called it SiteReader. And basically, SiteReader goes in and it breaks apart the full-text PDFs. It identifies the reference or bibliographies. It then parses each of the references into a unique item. It then does some automated cleanup, and then every single one of those items goes to Argentina. Well, not goes to Argentina, but it's looked at by somebody in Argentina.
to be reviewed by a set of human eyes. So even as we think that we have all of these cool tools, to get really good quality, there still has to be some sort of a human element. And the reason that we do that is so that people can get credit for the items that are actually referencing to their papers. 42% of the citations, and I think it's close to 8 million now, but 42% of the citations within SSRN reference other papers or versions of papers within SSRN. So what we've done is we've been able to create this kind of linkage. So if you come to an abstract page within SSRN, it's got a tab for references, because when we did some usability research, we found out that that was one of the #1 things that people were looking for, so we just made them visible, we exposed them. So you come to a page, there's references, you can look through it. And then there's another tab for all of the items that cite that particular paper. So you can go backwards and forwards in the literature very easily to try to get a flow. Jason and I had a conversation in Seattle, and Jason loves to go backwards into the literature to find out if the original paper, the one that kind of had that original catalyst of an idea, is the one that he really wants to cite in his research. So that flow of information, whether it's by following the DOIs, which in many cases don't exist for older papers, or being able to follow that flow of the author, is kind of important, we think. Now, one of the other things that we've added from a metric standpoint is Eigen Factor. So we've worked with Carl Bergstrom and Jevin West at the University of Washington, and they created Eigen Factor in a very simple sense. What Eigen Factor does is, instead of kind of looking at the one-to-one relationship, it actually does this mathematical round robin for all of the nodes within the network that are actually connected. So it gives you kind of a different take on what the broader influence is for a particular piece of research. Now, that's kind of cool, it's kind of neat, it's kind of interesting, but what really excites me is where they're taking it to the next step. And so what they're talking about, and actually have created, is this kind of map of science where you basically don't rely on a traditional taxonomy to figure out what you want to be looking at. Some of SSRN's most successful networks are the interdisciplinary ones. Cognitive science, corporate governance, entrepreneurship. We're about to release innovation. Sustainability has taken off recently quite nicely. So it's this kind of mingling of scholars and content and ideas from a whole bunch of different disciplines where you may not know the people who wrote that paper, but it may be the catalyst for new innovative research. My simple definition of innovation is creating something new by being exposed to a broader and deeper set of existing things. So what we try to do is try to figure out how to make this broader and deeper set of existing things as efficient and simple for you to kind of wade through. So getting back to what Carl and Jevin are doing, they've actually, this happens to be JSTOR, and I don't have an image that's clean enough yet for SSRN, but I hope to have that in the next few days. But basically what they've done is they've looked at content and they've created this map of science, so to speak. So it's not about where something's classified, but in a very, very simple and crude sense. If you think of the way that statistically improbable phrases worked at Amazon, where they kind of pull phrases within different places within the corpus and then pull them together in a way that is not necessarily a tagging or taxonomy or classification scheme, they create linkages that are not based on anything other than the content itself. Now, the cool part about this is that if you think about where things are going, then I would argue that this actually starts to solve some of the questions about where we can go in the future. And what I mean by that is that it's actually the map of science. And if you come to town, you land here in DC, and you're looking for the best sushi in town, I'm going to argue that you need two things. I'm going to argue that you need a map and you need a compass. And this is the map of the future in my mind. This is the way that content relates to other content in ways that's never been previously thought of. And the metrics can be your compass. They can help guide you through this map, this now overwhelming amount of content. Now, when SSRN started to try to figure out what we wanted to be when we grew up, back in about 2002, embarrassingly showing this particular slide of mine from days gone by, but we realized kind of at the core, and it doesn't really matter what the rest of the rings say, but at the core was the content. And then around that was the relationships. So from very, very early on, we realized that the relationships, these identifiers, author IDs, whatever you want to call them, but the ways in which the content relates to itself is critically important to having any of this work. Now, I spent a number of years at KPMG. I'm not the Ellen Rotenberg at KPMG, by the way. But I spent a number of years at KPMG, and so I asked some of my friends there when we were trying to figure out what to do. They came in and they said, well, sure, here's what you should do. And so they basically put together this slide, which I still have no idea what the hell it says. And I like to refer to it as, in the consulting speak, the money slide, which is when the client says, what the hell did we just pay $50,000 for? You slap this slide up on the screen, and it's like the Emperor's New Slide where they basically shut up because they don't understand it. Now, the one thing, first, thank God, because they were friends, I only paid $5,000 for the slide, so I'm still trying to amortize the cost over usage. But the one thing that I did get out of the slide was that it's still about the relationships. If we don't know the way that the things relate to one another, it's really, really hard to do any of this cool stuff that we're all talking about. Now, I actually shared this slide at an ORCID meeting last year, and Simon Hodson from JISC said, or he tweeted actually, he said, this reminds me of the Atlas experiment at CERN. And I thought about it, and I thought about it, and I thought about it, and I thought about it. And I said, yeah, it's kind of cool. It kind of does. It wasn't just a cute little quip. I said, that does kind of remind me of that. And so I thanked Simon the next time I saw him. And a good friend of mine, Salvatore Mele, who's at CERN, says that, at CERN they build really, really big things to smash together really, really small things. And what I got out of that was something of a bit of an epiphany, is that's what we're trying to do at SSRN. We're really trying to smash together a lot of research to figure out either what is the cause or what becomes or what comes from it. So I sometimes refer to SSRN as the scholarly communication collider, with tongue-in-cheek. But it is important to be thinking about the ways in which innovative research is being created is not by somebody holding themselves up in a room with a bed and a desk. It's really about sharing this information. It's really about smashing together these ideas. It's really about trying to figure out how to create something new from a whole bunch of stuff that's already existing. Now, at this point, I always come back to my second favorite quote of all time: "A new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die, and a new generation grows up that is familiar with it." Or as another scholar said to me a while ago, new ideas progress forward funeral by funeral. Now, I hope that we're all around to see all of these cool things come about, because we're in this room and we're actually smarter and cooler and much better dressed than the rest of the world, so therefore we get it. But the reality is that a lot of this stuff is just evolving. And that's probably why you're here, is to figure out how much you want to play in this game. Now, the second theme of this is about influence. And so I do want to think about a couple of things from that perspective. First of all, we worked with Eric Brynjolfsson a lot. He heads up one of our networks, and his research assistant, Heek Young, did a piece of research, and this is not public yet, so I'm not sure I should be showing it to you, but I'll show it to you anyway. And what Heek Young found out is that the citation counts for papers put in SSRN, controlling for quality and time and all kinds of other stuff, are 10 to 20% greater. Now, she says that it is likely caused by the free access. I would actually argue that it's likely caused by the free access and the identification of the content and the authors. By being able to understand what you're looking at, by being able to accurately represent who wrote what, and as silly as that sounds, I'll say it again, who wrote what, it makes a difference. Now, Google came out with this ranking, which has kind of been swept under the rug, but since SSRN came out on number 7, I really think it's one of the best things known to mankind. But part of the reason that SSRN gets that high of a ranking is our ability to know who wrote what. And if we think about influence, we think about why do people write stuff. Now, clearly they write stuff for a whole host of reasons. But the identification of who wrote what is very, very important. And where people actually publish is very important too. And one of the cool things about SSRN, and one of the things I love best about my job, is that I get exposed to a whole bunch of really interesting research. So we have a health economics network, and then the health economics network, a couple of months ago, this paper was submitted, and it uses this time trade-off method, which I'm not a health economist and I don't work in health services, so I read about it basically here first. But it talks about the cost-benefit of different treatments and things like that. But what they came back to was that scholars would sacrifice more than half a thumb to publish an AER. I'm not making this stuff up. That's influence. Now, on the last chart with the Google ranking, AER came in at 51. So there's 50 places above it to get more than half a thumb to publish in. So the thought that I want to leave you with is the following. The identifiers are important for a whole host of reasons. And the benefits are significant in ways that I don't think that we normally talk about. But hopefully in the last few minutes I've given you a chance to be exposed to some of them. And it's not Lori's job. It's not Ellen's job. It's all of our jobs to do what we can, because it's not going to work if we're expecting every single author to do it on their own. Thanks again for the opportunity to share the perspective from SSRN.
And again, we have time for some questions for Greg, if anybody has any, or yeah, go ahead.
It's Richard Patrick. Hi, Greg.
Hi.
You said that one of the reasons that you were high on the H index for Google Scholar was because you identify individual authors. I'm not sure that, to my mind, the H index doesn't work like that. It's about tracking citations from one paper to another, and the reason that you're high on the H index is because you have a lot more, Google Scholar has a lot more visibility of the grey literature, which doesn't come into impact factor. And I think that's actually the reason why you're high on that grade, which isn't, I'm not going to knock it, I think that's great.
No. The depth of the content clearly, and all of the related calculations that go into H-index clearly make a huge difference. What I was suggesting is that because we identify with the authors, and because we can actually tell the papers that are linked between the different papers, it makes it easier for us to work with Google to do some of those calculations. So we expose a lot of information to Google that allows them to see deeper into SSRN, primarily because it's open and for other sets of reasons and maybe some other places. But because they can see deeper in and because it's cleaner, then I would argue that the calculations actually become easier for them to do.
Other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Christine Orr from Ringgold, and Greg, I love the hand-thumb slide but I was interested in all the authors. They're all apparently from Erasmus University, but slightly different permutations of it. I was working on institutional identification. I was wondering, are you guys doing anything in that realm to uniquely identify which institution or group of institutions are used to particular kinds of research within SSRN?
Everything within SSRN is relational. So We have all of the traditional problems that anybody else does in that, Harvard University is a parent to Harvard Business School and Harvard Medical School and Harvard Law School, and the moment that you go offshore, it becomes the wild, wild west from a relationship standpoint, either circles or boxes or squares, or I don't even understand all of the shapes that they kind of come out to. Within SSRN, you can actually be a member, quote unquote, effectively have an affiliation with as many organizations as you want. So you can have an affiliation with a university or a school or a department or a center or multiple ones. But basically what we try to do is have you at the lowest level and then you roll up through the tree in effect. Organizations work similarly from a naming convention as the way authors do. So we have a name, we have then a alternative language name, and then we have a preferred display name. Most people think Harvard Business School is called Harvard Business School, which in fact it's not. The moment that you start to add foreign languages in there, it gets very, very complex and very, very messy. So we have identifiers for organizations similar to the way we have identifiers for individuals, and those have multiple names, quote unquote, so that we allow things to filter into a single identifier, and then we allow individuals to be affiliated with multiple organizations across either across organizations or within an organization. I like to say that SSRN's been much more lucky than it's been good. The fact that we had one of the first people we had involved was Ron Gilson, the law professor at Columbia and Stanford, half and half, forced us to be thinking about those type of relationships early on. The fact that we had Mike Jensen, who revises his papers continually from multiple decades ago, forced us to think about that problem early on. And because we had law professors and economics professors and finance professors early on, and they couldn't agree whether they were going to use Word or WordPerfect for the files that we were going to store, we picked this little crazy thing 20 years ago called PDF, and thank God we did that too. So from a structural standpoint, we basically had just create relationships either across or within an organization. And the hierarchy is a problem that I don't know that anybody has solved, and we have conversations that are interesting about that all the time.
Any other questions? Okay. Well, then I guess we'll take a slightly longer break. I think they're not going to set up until 10 o'clock for the break because that's the break for everybody. So you're welcome to sit in here or go out and wander around for a while. I do hope everyone will come back at 10:30 so we can hear Ewan's talk about altmetrics, which I think will be really interesting. And then, of course, for the discussion later, I know I've got a list of questions myself to sort of start things off, and I hope you've been thinking about that as well. Okay?